Welcome to Positive Philter with your host, Philip Wilkerson, a podcast that focuses on friends, family, health, and career, with a little self-help along the way. Please join me in this journey for self-improvement, and I hope what I have to share will make you a better person, thus making the world a better place. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and people. It's Philip Wilkerson back with another episode of Positive Philter. I'm joined by a special guest. Well, everyone's a special guest, but I'm joined by the esteemed former Madam President, current Professor Holton. What else? She got so many titles.
I got too many former titles.
Miss Holton. I don't know. What would you like me to call you on this podcast, Madam President? Or
I would love it if you will call me Anne, and I will call you. Do you go by Philip or Phil?
I go by Phil, unless I'm in trouble.
Yeah,
I go by Philip when I'm in trouble.
I thought so. But when I first got to meet you, you were Philip because we were honoring you in the formal context. So, yeah. So
I am just so blessed and so fortunate to have Miss Anne Holton join us today. She was the interim president, but she's currently a professor teaching at Mason in regards to education policy, which is why I wanted to have her on the podcast, because being an educator, I wanted to just learn about what she thinks in the macro sense of education from her world of experience. But before we get into this episode, Anne, can you give the listeners like a little background on you if they don't know who you are, which I don't.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted to, Philip. Yeah, I actually grew up in Virginia in public schools and had a very special opportunity when I was a 12-year-old, which we may talk about some later, but when my dad was governor of Virginia, I helped integrate the Richmond City schools, which it was kind of a formative thing for me, being part of something bigger than myself, something that mattered, kind of propelled me to a career in public service. I went to Princeton undergrad and Harvard Law School and went into a career working as a legal aid lawyer and thought I would do that for my whole life. But I've taken all kinds of twists and turns along the way. And I left that work to be a stay-home mom for a few years and then ended up when my husband, Tim Kaine, was elected governor, leading a reform of Virginia's foster care system. I missed one along the way. After I was a stay-home mom, I was a juvenile and domestic relations court judge for many years in the city of Richmond. Then I helped reform the foster care system in Virginia as First Lady. And then in one way or another since, I've been working in education. I worked with the community college system. I was Secretary of Education in Virginia. Then I've been a faculty member and for an interim period president at Mason.
That's such a dope journey. And obviously that's how our journey overlapped. I believe I was your first Employee of the Month ceremony. And,
you absolutely were. And it was a blast. And
that was my first Employee of the Month.
Well, it's a really fun tradition that Mason does to honor somebody special every month. And I got to do almost a dozen of them and meet some really terrific people doing great work. But you were my first and my most special for that reason, but also because of the amazing work you do for Mason. You really are a prince of positivity in that role.
Thank you so much. So, I did have these questions and it was very, obviously we're going to go back to the time machine and talk about your transition. But honestly, I just read the article that your brother wrote. About as one of the first white students in an all-black school. And you kind of just alluded to that. And I think that, I don't know, maybe that does spark this dialogue about education. But I believe that you were one of the first white students. So we always talk about that integration, vice versa, right? We always talk about that. Like my father was one of the first blacks to go to VMI, but we don't always talk about the first white to go into a space.
Yeah.
And so take us back in that time machine. I think it was a great article that your brother wrote about how during desegregation, you and your brother were the first. I believe you went to open.
No, actually. So he and I both went to Mosby together. I had one edit to his article, but I got it in too late. But he and I went to Mosby Middle School together. And then after that, when I finished middle school, I went to Open High. And then we had an older sister who went to John F. Kennedy High School, and then we had a much younger brother who wasn't yet part of the schools. But this was 1970, and this was one step along the long journey of deliberate speed of beginning to actually enforce the mandate of Brown versus Board of Education, which the case that came down in the 1954 saying that schools must be integrated. But obviously it didn't happen. All deliberate speed meant no speed for a long time. And then there were steps along the way, and some of the very poignant steps along the way, and some really amazing stories and interesting guests you could get on this podcast someday are the first African Americans who helped integrate public schools, who were the one or the two or the three, as you say, your father, God bless him, at VMI. And those were some hard stories. I've met some folks who were in those roles in the Richmond City Schools in the early 60s. The first African American to attend formerly all-white schools was tough. Ours was a later wave, and ours was the wave where the courts had said the essentially token integration wasn't working. Just various forms of freedom of choice weren't working, and so the courts ordered the schools bust to achieve racial balance, and basically forced the school's hands. And so in theory, my school would have been healthily integrated, but in practice, it was a formerly all African-American school, and most of the white people who were supposed to be there left town. Literally, that was sort of a big major white flight episode in Richmond City. So many people literally moved out of the city. Many people took their kids out of the public school system, developed these little segregation academies in people's basements. And so the very small handful of white people who stayed with the system, who had been assigned to formerly all African-American schools, got to have the flip side of that experience that others had, that some of our African-American counterparts had, getting to be the first white kids at what was essentially, for the 2 years I was at Mosby, an almost all African-American school. And I'll tell you, it was an amazing experience. There were some ups and downs, but we had it easier than the first Blacks who went to the all-white schools by a large margin for obvious reasons. But also, we were very welcomed by the community there.
Well, I love that. And I love that it kind of does bring it to my next question, because you said forced her hand and policy. So just in general, you teach, and education policy is in your bag, right? That's your wheelhouse. And I keep on hearing all the times, keep politics out of education, or keep politics out of sports, or keep politics out of this. But I just want to know, what are your thoughts when you hear that, keep politics out of insert some external education, sports, all that? What do you think about when you hear that? Because your story kind of alludes to that.
Well, it's funny because it makes me laugh, because it's basically impossible. Sometimes people say, keep the government out of my Medicare. Wait a minute. Did you know that Medicare is a government-run program? So, and the truth is, at least in the United States, and really most of the developed world, education is a core function of government. In most states in the United States, education is the biggest line item in every state budget, or if not the biggest, it's tied for first with healthcare. And depending on the year, healthcare and education are number 1 and 2 in every state budget. It is always either number 1 or 2 in every local budget. It is the politics that is most up close and personal to most people. Where your kids go to school, what the quality of their schools are. Parents care a lot about. Parents, most places, including Virginia now, elect school boards. So we have when people are more likely to meet politicians who are on their school board or their city council or county council, county board of supervisors, than they are other politicians that represent them in higher levels of government. It's a much more up close and personal thing. And it's impossible to keep politics out of a system that is politics is mainly about what do we want our government to do for us what do we want to fund collectively as a community through our government institutions. And as long as education is the top thing we're asking, one of the top things we're asking government to do and directing government to do, it's impossible to separate the two.
I love that. But then it kind of leads me into the second part of that question, or a follow-up, is that in recent times, we've had a lot of, what you teach in my schools, parents' involvement, and we don't have to go in deep to what parents are against, but just in general, like there's a lot of, because it's so intertwined with the government, so intertwined with policies, a lot of parents are saying like, they feel like they're not getting a role in education, or quote unquote, they feel like they're getting pushed out. I don't believe that myself.
No.
But so what do you think about that? What do you think about the actual parents' role in this structured organization such as education, the parents' role?
Yeah. Great question, Phil. And that to say that their politics and education are inevitably intertwined does not mean that partisan politics should be governing what's taught in our classrooms. That there is a long way between those two. I do think parents can and should and do have major engagement with the education system in all kinds of ways. Yeah, and starting with one of the simplest things that's been kind of lost in this recent debate is most school board members are parents. So, most people who go to the trouble, school board, being on a school board is not an easy gig. There's not a whole lot of glory there. The school boards get paid, but it's usually, if they ever were to calculate the number of hours they spend divided by the payment they get, it would be so much less than they would get making at McDonald's. They would, it's not a money maker. So why do people why do people run for school board? Why do people serve on school board? It's because they care about the schools. Most of them are parents or former parents, parents of either current or former public school kids. That's why they're there. So one way parents can and should and do get involved in public education is by serving, by running for school board, by supporting other people who are running for school board. Another way is by sharing input to school board meetings and issues. And, I sit on the State Board of Education, which is not the same as a super school board, but it's similar. Our Board of Education and every local school board has a public comment section of every meeting where we hear public input. We often hold public hearings on specific issues. So a lot of the recent debate is about what are we teaching students in the history area? We on the state board approve very detailed guidance that controls what's taught in the schools by our standards of learning. Our history standards of learning are, for each grade, they are a 4 to 5 page document that says what's taught. And then there's a curriculum framework, as we call it, which is a 40-page document that fleshes out in much more detail what's taught in literally every single grade. What's the expectation? So how is that determined? It's determined by the Board of Education pursuant to legislative mandate with public input, because we are required to and do have public hearings. We revise them every 7 years. Every subject matter goes through a 7-year cycle. And I'll tell you, Philip, we hold public hearings around the state when we're revising, say, the math, history, science. Nobody shows.
I was really about that follow-up because I've learned recent times as I've become more politically involved that there's so many decisions being made that are open, but no one takes advantage. So then they complain about it afterwards. So for instance, I'm on the renaming task force, and they said in this renaming task force of Lee Highway, whatever, they made it open to the public. You can watch it on channel 16. You can do all that. Right. And they ain't got no views. It's like 2 people, no one's coming to these things.
And I understand. People have got a lot on their plate, but there are, lots of things to be engaged in. And the truth is that people mostly trust that the system is mostly working pretty well. We do hear there are some organized groups we hear from. So we will hear, and actually Virginia is very blessed to have a coalition of groups that includes the PTA, the statewide PTA, which represents parents. And there's a superintendent's association and a principal association, a teachers association, the curriculum development folks, all of those folks, either those separate organizations or sometimes even together, will come forward and offer input. The Department of Education will also do organize essentially some sort of listening series where they'll involve history teachers and others at the local level to build up to those standards. So parents can get involved with their local PTA. They can get involved with statewide organizations. They can show up and comment publicly. They can reach out to their school teachers and principals and education leaders in all those different roles. And their involvement is incredibly welcome. I've never seen an education leader group that didn't welcome healthy parent involvement. Now, some of what we've seen in these recent months is people showing up and shouting over each other and threatening people. And, we've had school board members resign in Virginia because it wasn't worth the pressure on their families to be having public threats on their lives. So that is not the right method for parent involvement, but there are huge opportunities for parents to be involved throughout the system.
I love it, because I was about to ask my follow-up is then where is the miscommunication lie? Like, for instance, you think it's just lack of awareness, or where people these parents saying, oh, they're teaching my kids all kinds of stuff they don't know about. Well, where do you think that awareness is lacking? Is it because just they're not looking to join the meetings? Just anecdotal.
Yeah,
that's not science.
Good question. And this is sort of speculation. But I think people are. We've just been through such a tough period the last year and a half with the pandemic, and our whole world's turned topsy-turvy. And I think people are angry and frustrated about that and looking for outlets for their anger and frustration. And I think, sadly, there have been those who have capitalized on that anger and tried to turn it up into something that it isn't. I do think the pandemic, I just have such respect for, parents and teachers and education leaders over how we've navigated this last year and a half. It's just been almost impossible. And I say about education leaders in particular, they've been having to choose between bad options. It wasn't like they had good options. It's, do we make everybody mad by shutting down the schools, or do we make everybody mad by keeping the schools open? Do we risk our children's health, or do we risk our children's education? They didn't have good choices. Choosing between bad choices, it's been hard. It's been hard on parents who needed schools for childcare, for a place to keep their children safe while they go to work. It's been hard on parents who've been trying to motivate and help their children learn through online environments. So I'm not surprised that parents are angry and frustrated. I think some of this deliberate, some of it's that some folks have been stirring up what I think is racially tinged anger, and some of it is just a little bit of sign of the times of the mood, the national mood we're all in. Everybody's angry because they're frustrated. We all want this daggone phase to be over and get to go back to normal.
I love it, and I totally agree. I think definitely shout out to the educators. My wife is one. She's a school social worker, and it's just you're right. It's like two bad choices. I just remember going to the Zoom meetings with the parents, and there were these the signs that say send them back, but they weren't ready, and it just been a mess. And you're right, it's a line between okay, we take a year off of school, whatever, but kids get set behind, and also not just educationally but socially. School is such a good thing for their social well-being. But then at the same time, you want them to be safe. So I feel like they were between was it a rock and a hard place? There was no
absolutely
best decision to make.
Right.
So I definitely want to, I jump around topics, but you made quite a transition. I was, legal studies, law, Harvard Law, doing it. And then I remember the transition or read about how you became the Secretary of Education. Was that your first foray into the education, occupation space?
Not quite. So I had, but it was definitely not an intentional path.
Okay.
I loved my legal work. And then when I went on the bench, I loved serving as a judge in the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. I left that work because when my husband was elected governor in 2005, I could have kept working, but it would have been complicated, various conflicts of interest. And I had 3 children still at home. And the family conflict of interest time-wise, it made more sense. We decided that I would leave my judgeship. And then from there, I got involved in these issues of one of the issues I had been passionate about at court was young people who were aging out of the foster care system without clear paths to future success, career-wise, et cetera. And so I really championed those issues in my First Lady role. And it got away from, it got more into policy and less law, though I've really, in many of my roles, I've continued to benefit from my legal background, but haven't practiced law since I left the bench. And then after Tim's term was over as governor and we left the governor's mansion, I went, one program I had helped start while I was at the mansion was a program for young people aging out of foster care to get into higher education through the community colleges. So a program that provides extra support for those students who have a historically very low rate of going on to college and completing college. So we started this program at the community colleges. And then when we left the mansion, I went and ran that program for a year. So I had done volunteer work with various education-related organizations, but hadn't worked in education except for 1 year at the community college system before I was Secretary of Ed. So I say I did on-the-job training in education policy as secretary.
Wow. Was it that partnership? Was it like all VCCS or just particularly J. Sarge near where you were?
No, it was statewide. It was all of the Virginia Community College system. Well, when I say all, it was statewide. We had programs at 15 of the 23 community colleges when by the time I left. And I think that they've now expanded to all 23. It's a great program. It's called Great Expectations. And it's a coach model program that helps wrap around coach connecting to services and recruiting. They recruit students to aspire to higher ed through the community colleges.
Yeah, it's crazy because I used to work as a transfer counselor at Northern Virginia Community College.
Oh, good.
Working to get them to transfer to VCU. And we definitely came across some students that got an extra, not extra support, but got some support as they transitioned.
Great. I love it. I love those young people. And I'm sure you've had plenty of occasions in your different roles to work with young people who've come through the foster care system. And they are, some of them have seen things you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy that they've experienced in their young lives. But they are strong and resilient and eager to find their pathway to being able to take good care of themselves and other family members. Often they're raising younger siblings, when they're still children themselves. There's some remarkable young people, and I've loved every chance I've had to get to interact with them and help them get on pathways to successful careers.
So, that kind of successful careers and return of investment kind of leads me to my next question in regards to, I think during this landscape, the view of education has changed a lot, in particular about, is this really return of investment in a sense that college is the opportunity to a future. And I remember you said specifically, I can't remember if it was when you visited Mount Vernon, but you said something about that key. The education is the key to opportunity. It should be viewed as not just a cash grab or a way for students to get in debt, but viewed as like, this is the gateway to transform a whole generation. They're the first generation student. They go to college and they get to provide not only for themselves, but generations. Can you speak to that, like that mindset or that philosophy of education being viewed more as not just a business, but actually, as you like to think of it, as a key to opportunities?
Yes, thank you. Well, I love actually the topic, and actually one of the things I do in my courses at Mason, I teach both undergrads and graduate students in education policy, and we do a little bit of looking actually back at the history. What were the the history and the philosophy of what is the purpose of education. But absolutely, I am a believer that one of the key purposes and one of the reasons it makes sense for the public to invest so robustly in education as we do is to help create pathways for all students. It's fundamental to our democracy, our concept of ourselves here in the United States, to think that anybody born in under any circumstance can be successful, can have a productive, healthy life and support themselves and a family. It's a foundational belief about who we are, but it's not always true. An awful lot of students who were born into, and just luck of the draw, who are born into families that are challenged in one way or another, like the foster care kids I work with, or just born into poverty. Yes, people can, against all odds, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and accomplish without any help from anybody else once in a very rare while. But it is not, it's not easy, and it's not the normal pathway. Most everybody needs a boost, and education absolutely is meant to be a great equalizer in that sense, that we think of both our K-12 education system and our higher education system as ones that should be accessible to all and opportunity for all. And sometimes we live up to those ideals, not always, but sometimes we do. And George Mason is a great example of a place where we do. Mason is a student. I'm sure you're used to these messages, but Mason is a place that really brags about being an access to excellence place. So it is a place where you can come here without a whole lot of resources and can get a degree that will help you propel you forward. Now, when I say without a lot of resources, students do end up with a debt. Students do end up, as you know, a lot of our undergrad students in particular are working multiple jobs, et cetera. So with the higher ed costs having gone up as much as they have, it's not an easy pathway, but schools like Mason absolutely are living up to the goal of helping all students have access to excellence. It doesn't work that way throughout all of higher ed, but the Masons of the world are doing it right.
I agree. And I think I love that you spoke about history, because I briefly took a history or higher ed history, and that culturally it's changed and shifted. Historically, higher ed was the privilege of the elite. When we think about the Harvards and the Yales and the William and Marys, historically, it was the rich Thomas Jeffersons and George Washingtons that got it. And then there was a morph, and it changed and shifted as we, when they started introducing college to GIs and military veterans coming back during World War II. And now it's completely shifted where it's like, it's more wide open to everybody. But I think that, like everything, scalability, while we made it very open to everybody, with the scale growing and growing, it's created some new conflicts and interest or obstacles. Yeah, we talk about this a lot in my higher ed policy class, and I absolutely agree with your picture of the history. And and some of this I didn't know. One of the things I love about teaching, I've kind of come to teaching academia late in life, but I'm now getting to go back and learn and read things that sort of underpin things I've been working on all along, but that didn't know. But did you know? I did not know this until preparing for some of my classes over the last few years. We didn't, in the United States, we didn't have most students attending high school, the majority of students attending high school until the 1930s. We did not have most students graduating, a majority of students graduating from high school until the 1950s. So then, if you think of it, this sort of push to everybody needs to go to college, and when do we actually have a majority of high school graduates start enrolling in college? I'm not even sure we still do, but if we do, it's around the 50% mark enrolling in college, and then obviously not all complete. So a lot of this is really fairly recent history. A big push that made higher ed more accessible for all was the push towards community colleges.
as a low-cost way to get started on a four-year degree, or to get a post-secondary credential entirely that'll help propel a good career entirely at the community colleges. Well, the big expansion of our community college system was late 60s, early 70s. So really, we're talking a 50-year scenario. And so it's not a huge surprise. I mean, now we are at the rate where 85 to 90% of our high school students graduate high school. Yay. But think about, if you think about that over the course of the last 100 years, that's naturally progressed. Now, I think one of the things we need to rethink, the whole college debt piece, does it really, are we telling more students to go to college than, are we telling some students to go to college for whom it doesn't make sense? And are there alternatives? And the answer is, there are, the notion that you need some kind of post-secondary career preparatory work is, I think, accurate. But it doesn't all need to be college. There are non-college career technical programs where some folks can get either as an interim step and then come back and do a four-year degree later, or instead of a four-year degree, can get great credentials and jobs that we all, I can't ever get an electrician to come fix things at my house, right? But some of those degrees don't require a four-year degree.
Yeah, I think so. And plumbers and all that. So trade and vocational schools have a huge value. I totally agree. And then I was thinking about that. I'm a history major, and I thought about how much generationally, like, kids were working. Like, you're talking about not going to college. Well, back in the 1920s, kids was working in factories, before we had child labor laws. So the integration and societal view of school has shifted. And I think it's going to continue to shift, particularly into the 21st century, as we think about alternatives to learning, getting away from brick and mortar and making learning more accessible digitally. It's always just going to change. And I think the policies around it's always going to change too.
Yeah. And the policies are fascinating. Now, I think you're absolutely right about digital education and, different ways of slicing and dicing the pie. But one of the challenges, and this is back to the point about, is education really accessible to all? With the U.S. approach to higher education being largely funded by the individual, with loans maybe from the government, and some grants. I mean, obviously, Pell grants don't have to be repaid, but they don't pay the whole cost of education. So unless we manage to double Pell, which has been talked about, but unless and until that happens, people are going to continue to have to take out a lot of debt, and that means that it's if we let that get excessive, then we really are failing in our mission. We're, instead of getting folks a trampoline to life success, we're saddling them with debt that keeps them from buying a house, keeps them from moving on to adulthood and all those other ways. It's just, really crippling. And you said something about digital education, and that made me think some of the student debt crisis is not it's not the George Masons of the world. Some of it is these for-profit educational institutions, not all of which are bad, but some of them are giving very little value for huge debt obligations, and students are essentially being snookered into them. Or even worse. Exactly. Predatory, fraudulent activity is luring students in to taking on these huge debts. So there's some huge challenges we've got to fix at that end of things. And I say that because the for-profits have been some of the pioneers in digital, in online education. Now some of the more traditional institutions like Mason are catching up and doing good work. And there are now both non-profit and for-profit online education options that are good. But they're also, it's a buyer beware market.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about policy, because it's like, talking about the integration of politics in education, how like even bandwidth or internet access should be entwined, because it's, the policies around that. Or public schools, are public schools responsible for giving every student a laptop? Because now technically, we saw that with Fairfax County, right? Like all the kids got Chromebooks because when they had to go home, but there's kids that don't have internet or computers at home.
Right.
So what is the responsibility? Right. What's the responsibility of the government and education in regards to making it equitable, even in a digital space for students?
Right. And those are huge challenges. The good news is with some of the rescue dollars that Congress has sent to the states, many states, certainly Virginia among them, have made major commitments to expanding broadband access all across the Commonwealth, certainly. And I think other states are doing comparable things with the American Rescue Plan money. So pandemics have all kinds of problems, but that will be a silver lining. We will come out of this pandemic with more universal commitment to internet access and with greater realization of that vision. And also, I think of the expectation that the schools supply the equipment to allow students to take advantage of it. I mean, that's a challenge for our schools generally because we pile a lot of expectations on our public schools, and how much are the schools supposed to do, and how much can they count on families to do. And that's not just supplying computers for some kids; it's supplying health and access to healthcare and access to nutrition, et cetera. And are our schools? Is that a good thing to expect our schools to really become community hubs, wraparound support services, supplying everything that students, a broad reach of things that students need to be successful? Or, should we let schools be schools and let others bear those burdens?
So I got one question, then we're going to go to our last segment, which is called Shot for Shot. But my last question for you, before we get into it, to the last segment, is, just thoughts on legacy. I have a name, my father, paved the way at VMI. And then I didn't want to go to VMI.
Yeah. What year did your dad graduate at VMI?
Yeah, he graduated class of 72. So he went.
Oh my gosh! So he was one of the first African Americans. Wow.
I'll send you the article later. But yeah, he was one of the first.
I would love to read that.
Dick Valentine.
Congratulations to him.
Harry Gore. And I can't remember the last gentleman.
Yeah. And Harry Gore's and his siblings were classmates of mine in Richmond.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. At Open House. In that small world. Small world. But and is your dad still with us?
Yes. Yeah. My dad.
Oh, good.
My dad did. After that, he was in a uniform since he was 6. Boy Scouts on. Then after VMI, he did 30 years military, Army colonel.
Wow.
So my whole life was that. But it brings it up to like my dad. Made a name for himself and had quite a legacy. But as you can see, I didn't go into the military.
Yeah, that's right. You had to make your own way.
I didn't go to VMI. I didn't join Omega Psi Phi like him.
Oh my gosh!
I joined
Not
Alpha.
that.
No, so I joined. I really thought about legacy, but for you, I think it's the same thing. I've always met. Your father did amazing things. We shared earlier that a school was named after him that my wife student taught at.
Student taught at. Yeah.
So how do you this is the Anne question, not how do you deal with the legacy of someone, a parental someone that has made so much of impact on people and then made your own impact, which I believe you have had an amazing legacy yourself. But how do you deal with that? How do you balance self-achievement with honoring and respecting the past, as well as making a name and lane for yourself?
Yeah. Oh, great question, Paul. My dad, not just my dad and mom together, I just did a great job of raising us to be confident, independent young people. So I have 3 siblings. There are 4 of us all together. We grew up with this. We grew up with an expectation of public service, I would say, but with a recognition that could happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, when I say with an expectation of public service, my father was Presbyterian, and we grew up in the church. And I kind of always knew from a very young age that, God had a calling in mind for me, was the language I grew up with. But that the way would open So I at some point went more to, I attended Quaker services for many years, and the Quakers used the phrase, the way will open. I knew that there were, God had things in mind for me, but I knew that I wouldn't necessarily know what that was, and that I needed to be prepared and ready and open to possibilities, but that it might not be a straight line. So I never really felt like I had to follow in my dad's footsteps, if that's the right way to say it. And even this experience of when we helped integrate the schools back in 1970, my parents did such a good job of making us feel like we were part of that. We had technically family meetings. You know how those things go. Some people's votes count more than others. But we had family decisions about what we were going to do about schools, et cetera. And they made us feel like what we were doing even then mattered. So the notion, all I did was go to school where I was supposed to go and, do my homework and make friends like anybody else would. But we were doing it in the spotlight. And they gave us this sense of doing for others. And so that was deeply ingrained in me, but with the notion that I could fulfill that expectation in myriad different ways. My brothers, I will say, maybe partly it's because I was a girl, but my brothers had a little bit more heavy-handed I think my dad always thought they should both move back to Virginia and run for governor someday. And anything they did career-wise was like, well, that's nice, but how does that fit into your plan, my plan for you to come back to Virginia and run for governor someday? Which, but the good news is he'd raised them both enough to be independent and smart and do things like be a history prof and do the great work that Woody's doing. He's just got a fantastic, amazing new book out that I'm reading right now. And my brother Dwight, equally fascinating and wonderful career out in Oregon. And lo and behold, with my husband, with my dad not even trying, he ended up with a son-in-law who was a governor. So he got what he wanted to.
Yeah, I love it. And I love the family meetings. And I love that too. Like, I think about that legacy and impact. And I was like, share the same name. It's funny. Yeah. I'm a Linwood too. My middle name's Linwood.
You're kidding. How do you spell it?
Linwood.
Same as
Linwood.
My dad and brother. So my brother, who's Woody, that's short for Linwood. And it's a pretty unusual name, especially spelled that. Some people spell it L-Y-N.
Yeah, or Linwood Rose, the president of JMU. His name was Linwood, the same way as me.
Right.
But yeah, it was always interesting because my dad was Big Phil and I was always Little Phil. Yeah. Around his family, he was always called Lynn, just L-I-N.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So my dad is going to
never gravitated. People know me. People joke, like my line brothers call me Linwood just to tease me a little bit, like Linwood, but I never navigated.
My dad is actually Abner Linwood Jr., and so, as is my brother and my grandfather, and nobody ever went by Abner.
Yeah. I love it. So here's my last segment. It's called Shot for Shot. You get to ask me any question. I get to ask you any question. It's not even related to this topic. Do you want to go first or I'll go first?
I'll go first. Well, I just have to ask about your dad. So tell me what he's doing now. What a great career.
So 30 years, both my parents are retired, both recent. I think you met both my parents at the ceremony.
Oh, that's right. Of course.
My dad retired 30 years, Army Colonel. And then he did another additional 10 years working for the government. So he got 2 retirements. And now he is a delivery man for Honey Baked Ham.
I love it.
He's living it up.
He's an active man.
He just likes to drive around.
Retiring.
Yeah, he drives around and delivers catered sandwiches. And then he also is very politically involved, as in he is on the elections. He does the election polling station. So
good.
Every election, he's there. He's like super patriotic. He'd be wearing like this American vest and bow tie.
I love it. And
he has that hat. Wow. He has that hat that has like the veterans hat. Like he's American.
Well, I hope he stays connected to his to VMI too, because
they won't let him go. Good, I call all his classmates
because they need him. They're doing good work to rethink their whole approach, and it's good work, but they need support of great alums.
Well, his alums won't let him go. His brother rats, as they call him.
Good.
I call them uncles, like uncle. I got Uncle AJ and Uncle Dave. These are all these men that were my dad's classmates that they won't let him go. But that's what he's doing: delivering sandwiches, running election stuff. And
you give him my regards. That's
living
great.
his best life. So that's what he's doing. So here's my question for you as we finish out this episode. I know that you are an infamous clogger. I literally just learned what that was because of you years ago, and I saw your video. But I want to know a little bit more about that. And the listeners that don't even know what clogging is, let them know what clogging is. And I want you to explain that. That's my shot for sure. I want to
well, that's great, Philip. I love ending on that. So clogging is a kind of dance that goes with Appalachian mountain music, what the music crowd would call old time music, which is, people might kind of lump it in with bluegrass or country music, but it's a fairly narrow little category within. So what Ralph Stanley type music, if that means anything to you. And that genre of music, there's a kind of dance that goes with it. And it's called, some people call it flat-footing and or clogging. And, some people think there's a distinction between those two. If so, I'm not absolutely sure what it is, but they're both closely related. And it's a great, fun kind of dancing. It's very energetic. It's almost sounds like a tap dance. You're slapping your feet on the ground a whole lot. And you don't see it much outside of Southwest Virginia. I actually did not learn, I have roots in Southwest Virginia, but I actually learned it with a dance group here in Richmond, a folk dance group, when I was a kid. But I love it, and it's addictive. It's sort of like riding a bicycle. Once you know how, when that kind of music starts up, we have a great folk festival here in Richmond where I live mainly every year. And when the fiddle music starts, my feet are moving, and it's great fun. If you go to Southwest Virginia, you can go to the Carter Family Fold. You can go to a whole lot of other venues along what they call the Crooked Road in Southwest Virginia, the Floyd Country Store, et cetera. You can on the when that music starts up, the whole dance floor will a whole bunch of people will jump up, and strangers and friends alike will all be slapping their feet on the ground.
I love it. Well, we're going to land this plane. I know you have something to go to and do. So this is the end of the show. I call it shout outs and plugs. It means you can show love and shout out anyone you want to shout out. And then plugs were anything where you want people to follow up. Even plug your brother's book. Because
I'll do that. Okay, so my brother's book, and especially Phil, as a history major, my brother's book is called Liberty is Sweet. And his research is all about how people other than the traditional elites played a role in the American Revolution and those time periods. So learning about, there's plenty of role for the elites, but you're learning about how when George Washington first took command of the Continental forces, there were African Americans in the army up in Boston, and he immediately fired them all. He said, "Nope, we can't have. I'm a Southerner. Black people are enslaved. We can't have that." And then 2 months later, he changed his mind and had to change his mind, partly because he needed them. And meanwhile, on the other side, the British were trying to lure the enslaved people into running away and joining there was a regiment, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had a group called the Ethiopian Regiment that was 1,000 African-American former self-liberated enslaved people who had crossed over to fight for the British, hoping to get their freedom. So anyway, the role of women, anyway, you get the idea, the role of Native Americans, all in helping shape the outcomes and the future of our of the war and the future of our country. So it's a great read.
I love it.
Liberty is Sweet.
Liberty is Sweet. I'm gonna put that in the show notes. So how about any shout outs or anything you want to show love to? And obviously.
Well, I'll just the very last one I'll do is our education policy offerings at Mason. We have really some terrific offerings, graduate programs. We have a doctoral program in education policy. We have a certificate program through the Ed School where, basically a 5-course series in education policy. And then we have a partnership with the MPP program at SHAR where you can get a master's in public policy with an emphasis on education policy. We've got some great faculty doing really good work. You can learn more about them at our Ed Policy Forward website. That's our Center for Education Policy here at Mason.
Thank you. Well, Anne, this has been a great episode. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time and being willing to join me on Positive Philter. Like if you look at my book, I take notes just as much as a listener would. And so these are lessons for me. So I've learned a lot about your family, I learned about you, and I just really appreciate your time. So listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your family and friends. That's how people know about this. Please check out Woody Holton's book, Liberty is Sweet. Please check that out. And then if you have any questions for the podcast, you can leave a voicemail. It's 571-336-6560. That's 571-336-6560. Sharing positivity is a movement. Thank you so much, and we're done.
Thank you for listening to Positive Philter, a podcast that focuses on family, friends, career, with a little self-help along the way. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, and like the Facebook page, Spreading Positivity a Movement. Thanks for listening.